How's it going, everybody? Today I'm going to talk to you about my experience with lifting my 2012 Subaru Impreza. So to start with, first and foremost, let me say that this is not a professional instructional video. I am not affiliated with any of the companies I mention in this video. I am not responsible for your abilities or lack of abilities if you try any of the things you see in this video. This is for instructional purposes only, so no suing. All right, that being said, so here's what I found out. To start with, why did I do it? Well, if you're driving a stock Impreza, well, you can probably already guess why I did it. If you're anything like me, you're thinking of doing it too because you're tired of bottoming out on absolutely everything. I know I was just absolutely sick of it. So did a little bit of research on the forums, see what people were doing. Saw some people doing the Forester strut swap. I didn't think I really wanted to go that route just because the Forester is a different vehicle than the Impreza or the Crosstrek. So I didn't want to deal with any potential conflicts as far as construction of the strut, the way it was valved, affecting any of the ride characteristics, that sort of thing. So the Crosstrek struts, I know I'd seen some comments on the forum about, will this work? So I'm here to tell you it was a pretty painless installation. But here in this next piece on this video, I'm going to start with basically the completed installation. I'm going to start with the front and walk you through the back, and then a couple other things. Now, I don't have any before pictures or videos, so shame on me for that, but if you drive a stock Impreza, you already know what they look like. You want a before picture, go look at your car. That's what mine looked. That's what mine looked like. There's your before picture. So basically I was just looking to get a little bit more practicality, versatility out of the car. Of course, like I said, just tired of bottoming out on everything. I wanted a little bit more ground clearance so I could go some more places than I could with the stock ride height. Wanted the option to run some more aggressive off-road or all-terrain tires in the future if I wanted to. Basically, I just wanted a more all-around practical vehicle. And when I bought the car, it was what I could afford, and the Crosstreks were out of my price range, so it was always something that was kind of on my horizon. And so tax return season came up and pulled the trigger on what I needed to do it. So on the next piece of this video, we're going to just walk right straight through it. So like I said, what I did was just straight swap for the Crosstrek shocks. They came from a local wrecking yard, and in conjunction with that, I used the rear alignment kit from a company called Subtle Solutions. So the Crosstrek shocks gave me a 2-inch bump, so I used their 2-inch alignment kit. All right, so now in this next piece, we're going to jump right in and we're going to go from there. Installation of the front shocks is pretty straightforward. You take the old one out and bolt the new one in. The Crosstrek shocks are a direct bolt-in replacement, no modification needed. Just undo the ABS sensor line and the brake line here from the old shock. Unbolt these two bolts and then remove the old shock and put the new one in. Keep in mind that your top bolt here is longer than the bottom bolt, so make sure you don't get those confused. Also, the top bolt has a washer, bottom bolt does not. You do not need to remove the brake caliper. You just leave it on there. No sense in taking your time to do it. Now you will need to remove the sway bar end links from the lower A-arm in order to get the suspension to droop enough to get that shock in, because it is a longer stroke shock. So just undo that. You'll need a Allen wrench to hold the center stem in place while you remove that nut. So you should be fine with just undoing one side of the end links. You can do both if you need to, but I was able to do it just with removing one end link. But other than that, the shock itself bolts right in without too much difficulty. Now let's move on to the rear. So the rear shock install, here's where things get complicated. So as opposed to the front side where you just removing the old shock and putting the new one in, this one you are dropping the entire subframe to get everything out. This is where you use the rear alignment kit from Subtle Solutions. So you can see it right there. So that spaces the entire subframe assembly, drops it down all as one single unit, so the suspension geometry of the control arms and everything doesn't change. Just like the front, you will want to undo the sway bar end links. Again, that's to get the suspension to droop down low enough so that you can do the work you need to do. Bolting the shock in place, with the strut assembly rather. In terms of that, there's an access panel inside the trunk that breaks out. So you just undo that to get access to the top mounting bolts, and then the shock itself unbolts with no trouble. Now, here's where the difficulty comes in. So this subframe, when you undo these bolts, it's going to drop and dangle. And when it comes time to reattach all the bolts, obviously you're going to want to have the subframe assembly supported from beneath via floor jack and what have you when you're doing that, but it's not going to just raise right back up into the position that it was in. So here's where you're going to want some ratchet straps or something, so when you jack it back up, you use those ratchet straps to slowly and in a controlled way manipulate the subframe side to side, front to back, so you can line it up, line the mounting holes on the subframe up with the mounting holes on the chassis. If you allow this subframe to put any kind of cross-loading on that bolt, it's a fine thread bolt, you will cross-thread it and you will strip it. Ask me how I know. You don't want to have to take the trouble of tearing the whole thing apart, drilling it, tapping it out for a larger bolt. Save yourself the trouble. Now here's another thing. When it comes time to put these bolts back in, use anti-seize. I cannot stress that enough. Do not raw dog your car. Don't shove these bolts back in dry. There's no such thing as a properly torqued dry bolt. Don't do your car dirty. Use anti-seize. And in case you're wondering about the torque values, and hopefully you are, the torque specs from Subaru for these larger M14 bolts is 107 foot-pounds, and for these smaller M10 bolts is 58 foot-pounds. Again, anti-seize. Anti-seize is your friend. The rear alignment kit from Subtle Solutions does not include a brake line relocation bracket. I would suggest you get one. This is what that looks like without it. See how tight that's pulled? So the relocation bracket here takes this little metal tab and just relocates this a couple inches up, so it takes a slack, or puts some slack rather, back into that line so it's not pulled so tight. So aside from that, the rear suspension, like I said, there's a couple of things you have to keep in mind, but as long as you're taking your time and not rushing, and again using anti-seize, the rear suspension should go in without too much hassle. But again, anti-seize, 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 and again, use those ratchet straps as a third hand to help you keep that subframe in place when you go to reinsert those bolts. Do not cross thread, do not strip. Headaches that you don't want, I promise. This is the brake line with the brake line extender installed. As you can see, there's a lot more slack in the line here. No binding, no pulling the line tight. So, your choice whether you want to run it, I suppose. But for that extra 25 bucks or however much it is, I think it's about that. For me, my money, it's cheap insurance. Might as well run it. Definitely cheaper than replacing a torn, damaged section of brake line and then rebleeding your brakes and all the rest of it. Do it. So if you're concerned about your pinion angle and U-joints, so you're right to be concerned. Now the drop in this does change the operating angle of the pinion yoke here, as well as up here at the output shaft. However, they are changed both at corresponding rates. Since you're dropping this whole subframe, relative to its position, the pinion input shaft on the pinion, the angle should stay mirrored to the output shaft, so there shouldn't be an issue there. What you will have an issue with when you drop this operating angle on this drive shaft is interference with the catalytic converter. You can see there where I drove it for a little bit and it rubbed. So what you're going to need to do is take yourself a pry bar and just work it in here and just give yourself a little bit of bend in this exhaust pipe. Not enough to really kink it and, you know, obstruct flow, but enough so you get yourself a little bit of clearance there between the cat and the drive shaft, so it doesn't rub and scrape and score. So here is the car just after the installation of the shocks and the kit. Haven't yet put the new tires on, but got the alignment done and everything zeroed out with a little bit of work. I'll talk a little bit more about what went into that later in the video. As you can see here, just from the addition of the shocks, or the struts assemblies I should say, I got quite a bit more ground clearance over factory just from that alone. Next stop after this is to be putting the larger size tires on. So this is after installation of the new larger tires. Got me just a little bit of ground clearance above and beyond what I had before, sitting at the final ride height. For tires, I decided to go with the Michelin X-Tours. They're basically Costco's version of the Michelin Defender T&H, or H&T, or I forget. Either way, but they're basically the same tire. Michelin makes them especially for Costco, and it's the same tire, same tread life warranty, 80,000 mile tread life, and got real great road manners, real quiet, great fuel economy. And then for winter tires, I'm rolling Hankook iPike. The size is 215 65 R16. There's a little bit of rubbing, but not much. I suspect that's mostly up in the front fender area, and I should be able to deal with that. Shouldn't be anything I can't trim away or tuck back. So now we're going to see how she deals on the highway. I'm not expecting any surprises, but we'll see what we see in the next portion of this video. All right, so wrapping this up, a couple of tech notes and final thoughts. First and foremost, do not kid yourself thinking that an alignment after this install is optional. It is not optional. Get an alignment. Don't cheap out on that. Once you put these shocks in, your camber is going to be way, way off. Your front wheels are going to look like that. So get an alignment. Now, because of the amount of down travel on the front lower A-arms that you're going to be inducing with these longer shocks, the stock camber adjustment bolts are not going to be able to adjust those arms far enough to get your camber back into spec. Your alignment shop is going to need to install a special set of cam bolts with a higher eccentric to push that camber alignment back into spec. They should have them, or they should be able to get them. They're a fairly common item, but they will most likely cost you extra. So be prepared for that on top of above and beyond the cost of the alignment. Secondly, torque everything. I mentioned that in the previous piece there. Torque it, torque it, torque it. There's no such thing as a properly torqued dry bolt. Andy sees everything. Now when it comes to the torque on the subframe bolts particularly, and suspension bolts in general, the final torque needs to be done with the vehicle on the ground, with the weight of the vehicle resting on the wheels. If you try and torque the bolts with the vehicle up in the air, you're going to over tighten the bolts, you're going to over compress the bushings, which can cause them to prematurely wear out and fail. Additionally, you're going to get false alignment readings. So make sure you do your final torque on the ground. Gear ratio. So going to a larger size tire is going to affect your effective final drive ratio. So if you're driving the automatic with the CVT transmission, I think the final drive ratio on that from the factory is 370-ish to 1, something like that. So it might bog a little bit on the highway if you're running larger than stock tires. I've got the manual transmission, so the final drive on that is a 411 to 1. Shouldn't be much of an issue. I haven't noticed much of an issue so far in terms of ride performance. I just sit just slightly lower in the power band, which should work out well for me on the highway, which is where I do most of my driving anyway. So be prepared for that. So there's some rubbing. I expected that going in. I'm probably going to end up having to cut away a little relief access out of the inner fender wells because they do rub at turns, those tires do. So kind of expected that. Didn't expect the issues that were going to arise from the subframe that I mentioned earlier. So save yourself the hassle and learn from my mistakes. If you're going to be repeating this installation, be prepared. Have a buddy or have those ratchet straps, so like I said, you can get that subframe lined up before you try and insert those bolts, so you don't cross thread them and strip them. The track width is probably going to be different, so just by virtue of dropping down the front suspension, you're going to move the wheels in just a little bit towards the center line of the car. I haven't measured to see just how much difference is, but it looks like maybe a quarter inch, half an inch on each side. I'm not overly concerned with it at the moment, but it will affect the characteristics of the car somewhat in terms of cornering, braking, all those dynamic things that the car does when it's in motion. There's a lot of engineering and science that goes into how suspension is supposed to operate, so it will affect it somewhat, but I don't see it being that big of an issue. If it becomes an issue in the future, I'll just correct it with some spacers, and that should get my track width back into stock range. So overall, I'm very pleased with it. Got the effect that I was after. Got that additional ground clearance, on top of which it looks a whole lot better now. Very pleased that I can drive down the road and pass over a piece of debris in the road that maybe suddenly surprises me. I can just drive right over the top of it, rather than before where I was holding my breath and making a deal with God. So overall, initial impressions are very pleased with it. Shout out to Subtle Solutions. They make a great product, and throughout this whole experience of mine with them, I was in communication with them, and their customer service has been nothing but top notch. Very prompt responses to any messages or questions that I had for them. So if you're thinking of doing this, feel free to leave any comments on anything that maybe I didn't mention that you got questions about. But that should do it. Happy driving.